And with that, a little bit of housekeeping. I want to thank everyone for joining us today. If folks were joining a little bit late, my name is Hilda Vega, and I work with Hispanics and in philanthropy. I want to also appreciate everybody on the team who has been behind the scenes making these webinars happen. We have Lauren and Inaru from our comms team today, and perhaps a few other people on our staff. So I want to thank them very much for supporting our webinars. This is the first in a series of webinars that we're calling Shaping Tomorrow. And the reason that we decided to do a series like this is because we wanted to, from our point of view, as people from racialized communities of color, we wanted to ask the question, what does a transformed world look like for us and by us? So over the course of the next few months, we're going to be hosting a couple of conversations that explore that question and really anchor it in an understanding of what a multiracial democracy can and should be and how we get there. Today's conversation is going to center on climate futures, and we will be thinking about and dreaming about what that looks like and what that means for all of us. And we have some amazing guests who are going to share their visions with us. And I just want to share a little bit about my own personal interest in this, but I won't take too much time. But I do invite people to think about what brings you to this conversation, because for me, when I think about the future and I think about what I want our planet to look like, I think about when I'm invited in different spaces to, pick a deck of cards, because in philanthropy, we love little decks of cards and games, and we get invited to think about our legacy, and we get invited to try to articulate what we want the future to look like. And when I pick these cards, we have people dancing in the streets. We have people out in gardens, out in nature, and building and constructing things and learning. And they're all in green and diverse ecosystems. And there is a lot of community in these images. And so for me, that very much represents growing up in an intergenerational household with your parents and aunts and uncles and grandparents from Mexico, and also treating ancestral practices that were handed down from our families about farming, about the weather, about taking care of our home, about growing food with the same level of importance as we would going to Western medical doctors, participating in certain Western systems like banking. And so for me, all of these ideas about the future go hand in hand with what we know about the past, what's been handed over to us by our ancestors, and what we know from nature and what nature is consistently trying to teach us. Before we start, I also wanted to take a minute to acknowledge that we're all sitting with a lot in terms of what's happening in our climate right now. Definitely in the South, we've been working and thinking about ways to support folks who are impacted by Jodeen. And then we have plenty of people in Florida who we know we're going to have to support in the coming days, unfortunately. So I want to make sure that we are thoughtful about that and acknowledge that, but then also keep that in mind as part of the motivation for what we want to have these conversations. I am now going to invite our guests to introduce themselves and then start by telling us a little bit about the future that you envision, and then tell us a little bit about how you think we're going to get there. We will share a mural for people to go in, and the speakers will use some words and images that they put in the mural as an anchor for the conversation, but we invite all of our participants to go in and put in an image and think about different steps that you hope we engage in to get to the futures that we are all hoping for. We will start today with Christopher. Thank you, Christopher. I'd like to invite you into the conversation.
Eteapale menoazo, maut pele, the Kauyan glai, yen helshat, yen Esto'k, yen somisek, nenapolis yen yepes. Good morning, good day, everybody. I address you as relatives. And I gave you the formal greeting of my ancestral language. We call ourselves Esto'k, which means human beings. And we are some of the original autochthonous people of what's now considered Texas, Tamaulipas, Nuevo León, Coahuila, And we are not a federally recognized tribe, but we're still a tribe. We're still a people with elders and a language and tradition and songs and sacred sites and sacred histories. And currently I live in the settler town of Brownsville, Texas. And this is where I grew up, in Brownsville and Corpus Christi, so the Texas Gulf Coast. And of course, my Esto'k ancestors have been here since the beginning of humans living in this area. And hence we refer to ourselves as original people and as autochthonous people. I'm also here in Brownsville, the co-founder of the South Texas Environmental Justice Network. And we're relatively new, and we're also doing our best to resist colonization from the oil and gas industry here on the Texas Gulf Coast. And we're also trying to fight the literal ongoing colonization of space tourism and Elon Musk, who is disregarding all communities and disregarding all rules and regulations in order to build his star fantasies. And we are also in solidarity with Indigenous people and, of course, the original people of the land, the tribe I belong to. And we're also working in solidarity with people who have also resisted the building of the fascist border wall. And also we work with groups that try to make sure that migrants and people who are having their lives destroyed by the current political economy, that they at least have some advocacy down here. So mainly what South Texas Environmental Justice Network focuses on is the anti-oil and gas work, the hyper-industrialization and destruction of the environment down here and against SpaceX. But we also work with other groups in solidarity down here that work on migrant justice issues. And a lot of us have always been advocating against ongoing border militarization and the terrible environmental and cultural destruction that is the border wall. So I know I've spent most of my time just explaining where I'm at, but all of those locations are important to understand that right now, along the Eurocentric colonial border that we call between the United States of America and the United Mexican States, that this militarization is not only causing environmental damage and destruction, but it's also causing cultural and human destruction and the destruction of the lives of human beings who have come in this direction with nothing. And of course, what I'd like to offer in the short amount of time that we have together is an understanding that if we have liberation, or if we're looking for liberation and a climate future of environmental justice and liberation, that must be done in relationship and in solidarity with Native, Indigenous, autochthonous people. Right now, we have the word Indigenous sort of being used in multiple contexts, one of which is to identify people who belong to racialized categories and who may be descended from Indigenous groups. And I want to connect that to another way of thinking about Indigenous people of the land, but also the communities that continue their history, their culture, and their ongoing community relationship with their place. And that's something where we need to really, really think deeply what we think about with liberation and what that means. Because I think about liberation as liberation from imperialism. I think about liberation as liberation from exploitation, not only the exploitation of labor and the exploitation of labor, but the exploitation of natural resources, the exploitation of human and natural resources, and the creation of racialized people and racialized identities is to put people in this imperial settler colonial hierarchy where most of the people who are being exploited become racialized so that they can be put in a position of only being extracted from. And I also want to point out that our system of climate destruction that's happening now is also a product of genocide, an ongoing project of genocide. Because if you look at indigenous people as communities, distinct communities that were living in relationship with their environments, with their place, with their other than human relatives, plants, animals, and other spirits, the land, the water, the air, they were doing that in a way that is less destructive and less extractive because they know that these are relationships that keep us all alive together, right? And it is the genocide and the destruction of those peoples. It's been the destruction of indigenous and native people that clears the land and then transforms the land into something that which creates wealth, a colonial, imperial sense of wealth. So we have to look at the horror of genocide as connected, not separate from the ongoing genocides that we see today, but also that these genocides are being performed in order to create wealth for a small amount of people who don't care about life itself, whether it be the environment or human beings, or the fact that environment and human beings have always been connected. There is no artificial separation between humans and our living world, our living planet. So I say all of that to say that what our future looks like is going to be liberating ourselves from the mythologies of wealth, extractive wealth, and environmentally destructive wealth, into living our relationships with responsibility with each other and the land, the water that has provided our human beings with everything they've needed since the beginning of our species, and provides everything for all of the species we share our world with, all of them whom are precious, all of whom are sacred. And so moving forward into a future, we have to create solidarity with Native and Indigenous peoples, Native nations, Native communities. And we have to unlearn any sort of loyalty to empire and destruction and colonialism in order to murder our fellow human beings in order to take the resources and create wealth for a very small amount of people. The future is indigenous, repairing and reweaving together all of the relationships of our communities. And so for us right now, some people might consider themselves to be in sort of like the diaspora, sort of like a Latino or Latinx diaspora. We must recognize to what extent our ancestors were indigenous, and we have to support those indigenous communities that we may be living far away from. In my case, even though we were raised to consider ourselves Mexican American or Hispanic, we also know that that means that there are native and indigenous tribal peoples that still exist who are still fighting to save sacred sites and ancestral burials and ancestors. So what I want to say to people who may consider themselves in diaspora, find out whose land you're living on. Make relationships, respectful, reciprocal relationships with the land whose land you're on, because this whole hemisphere, every inch of it is native land. Find out whose land you're on and you're living on and that is sustaining you, and make your solidarity with the native people who have been living in that land for thousands and thousands of years, and unlearn your loyalty and dedication to the empire. Build solidarity with living native communities, with traditions of life, and decouple yourself, de-identify yourself with empire and destruction and exploitation. And the future of a healed earth is going to also be a future of communities. Our healed communities are healed indigenous communities. And I thank you very much. And I could talk about these kind of topics all day. I thank you very much from the bottom of my heart for listening. So in our language, we say, Nenapale, Ayamapayasel. Thank you. Give life. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Christopher, for these really powerful words. And I hope that we do get to come back in the Q&A to talk about empire. I could talk about empire all day, so maybe one day we will. But right now, I would love to turn it over to Grace. Grace, please introduce yourself and talk to us about your vision and how we get there. And also, once you introduce yourself, I'm going to ask our team to please put up the mural.
Yeah, good morning. Well, good morning from Oakland, California, where I'm based. My name is Grace Anderson. I use she, her pronouns. Yeah, so many thoughts on what was just shared. Thank you for that, Christopher. By way of introduction, I'm a Black woman, I'm a queer woman, and I'm working at the intersection of resource mobilization, climate justice, and Black dignity and imagination. And I wrote notes today because my best thoughts come to me at 11 o'clock and it's only 9:51. So this is my attempt to be linear and concise. So I'll be reading a bit. But yeah, I just started an organization. So historically I've been in the outdoor and environmental. Linear is overrated. Historically, I've been in the outdoor and environmental sector. I got my start as a park ranger many moons ago, but my mom still says I'm a park ranger. But many moons ago, I was a park ranger. I spent a lot of time backpacking and climbing and instructing in various parts of the United States, and eventually started a career in environment because I needed an office job at some point. And started with like the Sierra Clubs of the world and other big conservation organizations as like a young Black queer woman, and soon found that they weren't made for me in any way, shape, or form. I used to think about like John Muir turning in his grave every time I walked into the Sierra Club. And so eventually had to leave the field and try to find, or leave those institutions and try to find a place that reflected me, celebrated me, reinforced me. And around that time, I had a mentor who started an organization called People of the Global Majority in the Outdoors, Nature, and Environment. And I got to lead this organization specifically for Black, Indigenous, and people of color for 4 years. And it just reinforced my knowing that we have all that we need, and it's in community. I think historically we've been like siloed into DEI work instead of like building towards what we actually want to be knowing and doing. And so I led PGM1 for several years and stepped away in 2020. And in 2020, decided to start building an organization that was deliberately for Black women, Black trans folks, and Black non-binary folks. It's called the Lupine Collaborative. And it's my response to the misogyny and like insidious anti-Blackness in the climate and environmental movement. And I also recognize that when you fund and resource Black women, trans and non-binary folks, like resources never stay with us. We always put it back into the community. And so I know when we're centered that everyone will be free. And so I called it the Lupine Collaborative. I'll drop the website in the chat so you can see what the lupine looks like if you haven't seen one before. There's this purple stocky flower. I find them in the high deserts. I think I saw them for the first time in Wyoming, but they're also in the Santa Cruz Mountains. Sometimes they're yellow, sometimes they're purple. On the website, they're all purple for brand purposes. But they are nitrogen fixing plants. So after Mount St. Helena erupted, lupines were the first plant to come back, and they put oxygen in the soil for other plants to come back. And that's what I know Black women, trans, and non-binary folks do in a society. So operating with that when Black women, trans, and non-binary people are resourced, we emerge to do the work we know needs to be done and make the soil rich enough for others to take root, survive, and thrive. Lupine operates with the knowledge that climate change and environmental degradation impacts every aspect of our lives. So our solutions must be intersectional, bold, and challenge the mainstream environmental climate paradigms of what it looks like to support and sustain Black life on this planet. And Lupine operates with the understanding that the movements for justice, including climate justice, are interconnected, and we must unify and deliberately intertwine our fight for queer and trans liberation, housing justice, abolition, reproductive freedom, and economic justice to make sure we bring everyone along. And the 3 strategies that I'm choosing as my theory of change based on my own experience and yeah, just being in deep community with Black folks for several years is narrative shift in storytelling. So equipping Black women, trans and non-binary writers with the resources they need to catalyze and distribute our work and our narratives into the world. And we'll be announcing a partnership with a publisher soon who's going to support us in getting more writing by Black women and trans and non-binary people out into the field. Instead of having people come in and try to write about us and for us, we just need to put the resources in the hands of the people that know and have the lived experience. I think so often like the climate justice movement, sometimes I'm like, how do we make it intersectional? It's like, oh, we just need to resource the people who are living intersectional lives and like living and breathing at the intersections. And yes, I will slow down. Thank you for that. So there's that, and then gatherings. With gatherings, I think white supremacy and capitalism, I know white supremacy and capitalism makes us to feel like that we're alone in this world. And like, I know many of us have had the experience of being in an organization and being the only one, but that is like far from the truth. And so gatherings to like support, sustain, and reinforce that Black folks are indeed in the climate and environmental movement, and also reinforce the ways that we are working. And it doesn't often look like the ways that the mainstream white paradigm has taught us. And the last strategy I'm working on is a guaranteed income, because economic justice is a significant part of climate justice. There's just so many ways that like not being able to live on this planet and to be able to afford like a thriving existence on this planet is leading to the destruction of it. All of these, I lost my notes. And so the way that I think about this, 2 years ago, a foundation gave me a chunk of money to live off of. I grew up really poor and will always like be a backbone in my family system. So they gave me a chunk of money to live off in order to realize the vision for Lupine. I'm like, oh, more Black folks need this. I'd never want to be a unicorn. And so giving Black people like $200,000 over 2 years who have a solution in mind, and wrapping that around with like also like financial literacy and a project budget to bring their climate solutions to life, and also loan forgiveness, because those of us who are doing this work like by the skin of our teeth aren't often like abundantly resourced to do it. And so working on a guaranteed income model to support those of us who have the ideas and just need the resources. And again, underpinning these strategies are the need for economic justice, narrative power, community resilience, and visibility. And so when I think about the future, the mural board's up, but I didn't put a visual in because I'm not a visual person. And I think in many ways it's beyond my imagination visually, but I can talk about what I think it will feel like. I think much of what we see with climate disasters are the result of hoarding and extraction and the genocidal removal of people from their land. So when I think about what the future would feel like, it feels resourced. People have all that they need to thrive on this planet, and that includes living wages, safe housing, access to live, breathe, and dream and play in a clean, healthy, and thriving environment. And everyone has what they need and aren't struggling or stressed to get their basic needs met. It's also dignified. I like to spend a lot of time and energy making sure that the work that I put out into the world like reinforces people's dignity and like supports people in feeling upright in this world, and being able to live into the truest vision and versions of themselves. And then it's joyful because, yeah, I think that like when people are able to have access to resources and dignity, that like leads to like limitless joy. And so when I think about a vision for the future, it like feels like very abundant and like bubbly and light and exciting. And I think we get there by returning the land, returning the money. Like I think philanthropy really just doesn't need to exist because it's just like it is like such a visible reminder of like wealth extraction and hoarding, and in a future philanthropy doesn't exist. Money has been returned and we all just take what we need and not more than that. And then we get there by committing to dismantling systems that don't serve the whole. And we also get there by putting time and resources outside of the reformist approach. and putting funding and other forms of capital towards people and organizations that are paradigm shifting, pathfinding, and working towards abolition. Yeah, and I will stop there. Thank you for the chance to introduce myself.
No, that was amazing, and really appreciate you sharing all of these threads of your experience and everything that is leading you into your vision. I also am seeing this thread of capitalism that we might want to get back to at the end of the conversation. So the next speaker I'd like to invite in is Tory, and Tory has a video that they want to share. So can you let our team know when exactly you want us to share the video?
Yeah, I'll definitely do that. I'll speak
thank
for
you.
about So hi everyone, my name is Tory Stevens. I am the creative manager of climate fiction at Grist magazine. I founded and manage the project Imagine 2200, which invites people to dream, envision, and present short stories that are anywhere from 3,000 to 5,000 words. And we receive those stories from all over the globe, and we're asking folks to dream of a future that is clean, green, and just. And the stories we get are beautiful. And so I'm going to show you a video. This is just one image that I think represents the kind of the green, clean, and just future that we want. If you could roll the video, that'd be great.
Like a lot of us.
Thanks so much for playing that. So I showcased that video. That video is actually the original one is a Chobani commercial, but this one has been decommodified. So you don't see any of the Chobani products in there. And it was created by someone in the solar punk movement, which is a movement of folks that have been writing stories. They're a huge DIY community as well, but these folks have gravitated towards the Imagine 2200 collection that we've been producing for the last 4 years. So even though we call ourselves a climate fiction initiative, we've been getting a lot of stories from the solar punk movement because they see they like that we're asking and inviting people to dream of the futures that we want. That's one of the biggest things that I want to have folks take away with to kind of give you in this talk is that, you know, I read a lot of stories. I used to be a fundraiser. I wrote a lot of the appeals that you get in the mail. And one of the things that I noticed when I was writing appeals is that people are interested in other humans, right? So for a long time, I was writing stories and told to write them from a statistics kind of point of view. I used to do a laundry list of the great things that our organization did over the last quarter, and it kind of read like a laundry list. But then I started advocating for more human-centric storytelling. I was really into the blog. I don't know if everyone knows this, but it's called Humans of New York. I'm kind of dating myself. When this first came out, it was like, pretty groundbreaking, or just, I mean, it's storytelling, so it's not that groundbreaking, but the style was online to kind of just sit with someone and hear their story. So I brought that kind of storytelling to fundraising. Now that's kind of typical in fundraising. You know, you hear about Brenda who has Medicaid, and you know, let's donate some money so we can fight back and make sure that Brenda has her Medicaid. But that's the kind of storytelling that I want to bring to climate fiction, which in the past has been very dystopian, has been, you know, a lot of doom and gloom. And what we're asking is for more folks to dream about the future that we want and deserve. And, you know, a lot of these, the visions for the call for submissions that we put out to the world, you know, I received these and understood this because I was reading a lot of indigenous futurism. I was reading a lot of Afrofuturism. I was reading a lot of queer futurism. And the thing that all of those futurisms had in common is that they were not looking at the white gaze. They weren't writing for white folk. They were writing for their own people, to showcase and show a vision of the world where you know, it's their folk are liberated, that their solutions are the ones that are coming to mind. And even though it's like futurism, some of the solutions were that we had to go back to some of the indigenous wisdom and knowledge that had been around for thousands of years. And so I was reading a lot of these stories and, you know, really trying to understand what kind of climate fiction contest we wanted to have at Grist, because Grist 4 years ago didn't have one, and it was my I was charged with kind of developing that. And, you know, reading all that Afrofuturism, that indigenous futurism, and seeing kind of the themes and threads between all these stories, I was like, well, we need that in climate fiction. We need climate fiction that dreams loudly, that looks to resource people abundantly, that is justice driven, that has climate solutions, but climate solutions that care about folks on the front line. And so today we receive about 1,200 stories a year. We review those stories, and those stories have all different sorts of visions in them. And so one of the other things that we encourage is that for other people to vision. It's not just something that like a leader does. It's not just something that like a kind of elite group of people who have the time to do it. We want to resource people and allow them the time to kind of dream. And another big part of this in that I see people writing about a lot is that they want more leisure time with their community. They want more time with their community in general. In the United States, in the Western world, and, you know, modernity is spreading in pretty much every corner of the earth. And what people consistently say is that they have less time to kind of be with their community, rest and heal, restore. And so we definitely caught that vibe from the healing justice movement, the folks who are really advocating for folks to have more leisure time. You could say that socialists have been doing this for a long time. And so there's a lot of folks that have informed us. And so when we put out our call for submissions and they're looking for these stories, we kind of shape what we're looking for, which is the part that is great. You know, we ask people to think differently. If we just said we want climate fiction stories, I guarantee you we would get a lot of climate fiction that is dystopian, that doesn't center justice, that is not culturally authentic, doesn't have intersectional characters. But we flip that on its head and we create the funnel, and we create the funnel to some sort, but we also create the impetus by, you know, just asking for this thing, asking for a contest that wants culturally authentic stories, intersectional characters, justice-driven stories. And I think that is something that is necessary. You know, reading the stories is necessary, but we need to encourage writers to write in a different way. And so that's what we're doing. That's what I think, you know, this kind of collaborative process and this work with writers and readers is the future. It's like this collaboration around what do we think the future will be, is really important, and really honing in on the things that we want to bring into the future, and kind of shedding the things that we don't want to bring into the future. So we don't have stories that are based on extraction. We don't have stories that are, based on kind of hurting people and violence and things of that nature. And yet we still have really good stories. A lot of people said you can't write a story without, kind of these things. That's not true. These stories have conflict still. These stories have rich characters. And, because even in the future, if we get a lot of things right, there's still going to be some stuff to work on because we're human. It's not going to be perfect. These stories are not utopian in any way. What they are stories that help guide us and envision a world that is clean, green, and just. And I hope to chop it up with y'all a little bit more. And definitely check out that video when you have a chance. It's called Dear Alice. And I guess we'll send it in the follow-up email to this event. Back to you.
Thank you, Tory. Yes, and we will share videos and decks and other resources with folks in the follow-up email. So that's the folks who joined us, but also everyone who registered for today's webinar. I have to say, y'all are killing it with the time. Everybody has been right on time so far. So thank you very much, Tory. We'll come back to you when we do the Q&A, but I'm going to hand it over now to Jodeen to introduce themselves and talk to us about their vision.
Thanks so much, Hilda, and thank you much to those who have been sharing about their vision. Miskagoe tetere a ame alejun shik suma brihida skywater kumbeata toe. Greetings. My name is Jodeen Olguín-Tayler. I'm with the Climate and Clean Energy Equity Fund, and I'm really pleased to be greeting you today in the spirit of shared purpose in our work and a shared purpose of working for decolonization and liberation for all of our people. I'm joining you today from Colorado on occupied Ute, Cheyenne, and Arapaho lands. And I really deeply appreciate the invitation to share about our vision for the future. And broadly speaking, the vision that the equity funds have for the future is a future where people in Black, Indigenous, Latinx, AAPI, and immigrant communities have governing power to create the conditions for an equitable clean energy economy and an inclusive democracy where communities are both leading and thriving. And so at the equity funds, we center the vision for the future that our 200 plus grantees have. And those are visions that are based on their local conditions, on local needs, and importantly, the solutions that they have for creating a clean energy future where they are leading and thriving and able to be rooted and governing in their communities. So with that in mind as the vision, which is to say the vision is not one that we hold, but one really that is generated by the communities that we support and serve. I want to really dig into the invitation to share what we think it will take to get to that future. And so Malvika is going to share a little bit, some slides for us. And so our work is really premised on the idea that climate change isn't just a problem. Our perspective is that climate change is specifically a racial justice problem. And it's a problem that has come after centuries of disinvestment, of racialized capitalism, and that climate change is happening in an economy and democracy with structural inequality. And so next slide, please. Because of that, we see that addressing climate change is not fundamentally, it's not a problem for science. It's not a problem for the best tech solution or the best research. It is fundamentally a problem about political will and who has the power to determine the ways that we should be living and what the solutions should be. And so building that sort of political will requires power, and it requires very, very specific types of power that need to be working and grounded in community in complementary ways. So if you go to the next slide, we as a funder, we believe that we need to be supporting movement building for systemic change. And so for systemic change to happen, movements need to build 3 types of power to drive change. The first is structural change. So the power to change policies and who designs and who benefits from and who decides on public policies. So to build structural power, that's structural change. The second type of power is the power to drive narrative change, which is change that happens by transforming and shaping our public narratives, our public imagination, beliefs, expectations, and even assumptions about who it is that should be leading, and what is driving the forces in our economy. In our case, this is often about contesting the fossil fuel industry's propaganda that has falsely pitted the economic growth of the economy against clean energy and climate action. So these things are not actually in tension. We can have thriving communities, we can have safe jobs, we can have rest and restoration, and that is not in contradiction to having a clean energy economy or to having climate action. Those things are actually need to be the same for it to work. And so we really work to forward a new public narrative that positions climate action and clean energy transitions as one of the greatest opportunities that we have to build a more inclusive and equitable economy. But that all hinges on who is leading those solutions for our economy. And then the third type of power that we work to build is that successful movements build is changes in people's behavior. And I'll say more about that in a second. So all three of these changes happen by building and shifting political power. Malvika, if you go to the next slide, which is how we build sufficient political will to create change. And so next slide, our work at the Equity Fund really came out of one of the things that's really unique and makes me really proud and feel very excited about the colleagues that I work with at the Equity Fund is all of us come out of organizing. We come out of organizing in our local communities and doing that work. And we were deliberately designed as an intervention in philanthropy to change who has power and to advance this power building that I was speaking of. And so we come out of sort of an assessment of understanding the environmental justice movement, the so-called mainstream climate, the mainstream climate movement that has really been white-led and dominated and excluded folks of color, and then the electoral organizing infrastructure. And what we support, what our grant making is supporting to do is to really leverage the assets and strengths of each of these siloed sectors and then change who is in leadership. So if you go to the next slide, we really work in movements, come out of and work in movements for economic justice and racial equity. And so there we are organizing and changing the behavior of social justice foundations. We are working with membership organizations rooted in communities of color. We're also working with workers' center and labor unions. Within the mainstream climate movement, we're organizing and shifting the behavior of climate funders, of big green environmental groups, and of climate research specialists. So really changing how those actors see movements for racial and economic justice as needing to lead and making them, disrupting them, making them much more inclusive. And then with the voter engagement infrastructure, we work a lot with civic engagement funding networks to shift how they're making their funding decisions and who they're funding. We work with voter mobilization technologists who have oftentimes created technologies that exclude work in our communities or deploy strategies that aren't culturally relevant for us. So we work with them on those changes. And then we also work on building national and state communications hubs and shifting who is in leadership of those hubs. So those coming out of those movements and working at those intersections, we've designed our work to really provide support and assistance to support the community organizations to do three things that are absolutely necessary for climate equity. So our capacity building and grant making supports community organizations to advance and win policy solutions by building and shifting power to determine who decides and who benefits from public policies. We provide technical assistance and support to community organizations so that they can lead large scale. We're not talking about like small amounts of money, but supporting community organizations and BIPOC communities to lead large scale strategic communications work that's determined by them in their voices, culturally relevant to their communities, and to serve as the trusted messengers that they are in a large scale way with accessible platforms for their communities. We work on transforming public narratives by promoting a new consensus on solutions for effective climate action and demonstrating that communities of color can and must lead on those solutions. And then through our donor advising work, as well as the programmatic work we support, we're changing the behavior of decision makers so that both our civic and our philanthropic leaders build infrastructure that invests in equity as a strategy for achieving impact. So if you go to the next slide, I think as folks who come out of community organizing and who have been given, I think, both the privilege and the responsibility to be working in philanthropy at this time, a lot of the work we see ourselves doing is actually organizing within philanthropy to shift behavior and shift how resources are distributed. And to do philanthropic advocacy work at the same time that we're just moving money to communities to lead on these solutions. And so, one of the reasons we're thrilled to be in conversation with you all is to just be united in this purpose, not only of supporting communities and moving resources to communities to lead work that they self-determine and that they believe is going to generate the solutions that they want to need, but also to be finding other co-conspirators in philanthropy and to be working and organizing with each other and organizing more resources to move out to communities in ways where, we're not controlling or dictating them, but simply liberating resources so that people can put them in place to do work that's transformative and supports the liberation and thriving of communities.
Thanks so much, Jodeen, and thanks everyone for sharing your beautiful visions. We have one question right now in the Q&A, but folks, please don't be shy. Please put your questions either in the chat or in the Q&A. Let's see. So they ask, how does shaping our future for a collective liberation look when it comes to being multiracial, multi-ethnic? How do we go about building genuine partnership with white individuals in this effort rather than othering them? So does anyone want to go first on that one?
I know what it looks like in the writing space. I can answer it from that angle. So, there's been a debate in the literary world for a while whether it's okay for white folks or folks that are not from one particular community to write about another community. And the tack that we take at our project is that we're fine with it. We encourage folks to write stories that are coming from their heart, but if a story feels fictional to you from your heart, then it's probably coming off as fictional. And so what do I mean by that? You write about Black folks, but you don't know any Black folks in your life. And you haven't, sat at the table with Black or brown folks, so and it comes through in the writing too. When we read these stories, we can kind of feel it out and kind of know from some of the verbiage and the way that it plays out. So what we encourage folks to do is be in community with Black and brown folks and, and start from there. Don't just start writing about stuff that you really just don't know. I know it is fiction, so there's that allure to kind of do that. And, the second thing is, if you can't be in community with folks just because of how your life is right now and where you are, then the second best thing is to really do some serious research on the topic that you're going to be writing about. And so that is something that we encourage folks to do in addition to the community building that they should be doing. But and obviously don't perpetuate stereotypes. That's one of the biggest things that you see in kind of writing. There'll be a beautiful story that comes in and you can tell the person is not self-aware or doesn't have the self-awareness or the knowledge or the partnership or community, and they're perpetuating stereotypes even though they wrote a really great story.
Thanks for starting us off, Tory. Christopher?
Thank you very much. I want to say thank you to Tory, Grace, and Jodeen. I think your voices are wonderful to listen to on a Wednesday and probably every day. Thanks. And I just want to add that it's something I've been thinking about a lot too in our work here down in the so-called Rio Grande Valley, and that is just how many different sort of boundaries around people and identity have been created. And the racialization, as I mentioned before, the racialization under capitalism has been for the purpose of exploiting labor and natural resources. And I also, harken back to what I was talking about is the sort of healing and restoration of reciprocal, respectful relationships, not only between individuals, but between communities and their relationships to the land, water, air, to the place that includes all these other species that we are in communion with, even though our language, English as a colonial language, Spanish as a colonial language, doesn't have the means by which we can communicate those living relationships with each other. And empire and capitalism has not just murdered people or taken wealth out of the land, it's actually destroyed relationships and bonds of community between human beings individually, between human communities and their place, human beings and their communities and individuals and other species, because we're extracting from other species rather than treating them as relatives. And so it's just when that question was asked, it just hit me in the pit of my stomach that it's a hard question. It's an important question that can't be answered by one person in 2 minutes. But in rebuilding those relationships, that's part of the healing, not only as individuals, but in communities. And it's not always going to be comfortable, and there's going to be tension sometimes, but we can try to face them with as much compassion as possible, because we have to understand this building of empire in this hemisphere has been 500 years. That's going to be a long and a lot of work to repair, unravel those chains and reweave sort of like the cloth of what it fully means to be fully human. And also on the economic sphere, a lot of the people that we are in community with are not wealthy people who identify as white or people who have loyalty to Euro supremacy. The people that we're building and that we're fighting our struggles with are poor people who are disenfranchised economically, and they're given this notion of white supremacy as sort of a way to keep their loyalty to the 1%. Sorry for that metaphor. And so rebuilding those relationships is what's going to have us identifying with our humanity and not, again, identifying with empire, or in this case, sort of a Eurocentric, white supremacist, capitalist empire. Thank you.
We have a few more questions. Oh, Grace, were you going to? Yeah. Good.
Yeah, I'll just add briefly. Yeah, I try not to spend too much time thinking about this, because I think that's how we got here, like putting a lot of energy into bringing white folks along. But what I will say is I try to approach this with like an embodied partnership perspective of like, everyone just needs to go do their work of like, who am I in this world? What are the resources and privileges that I have access to? And what do I bring to this movement, and operating from that place? Because I think often when we're asked to like partner with white organizations and people, it's like we're having to give so much that distracts from our own work. And so something that I like to share with people before they think about partnering with Lupine is the Building Movement Project's social ecosystem map, which I dropped in the chat. I think it's an important tool for people to spend time with, like in any movement, of like, how do we get clear on the different roles that make up a movement? And like spending time asking yourself questions about like, what is it that I bring and why do I want to build these partnerships? I think sometimes we build partnerships just to do it without like really interrogating if they're effective, aligned, and transformative. And we let them go on for too long sometimes. And so I think like an embodied partnership approach and supporting people on that is how I like to think about that question.
Jodeen, did you want to add anything?
No, I support everything my colleagues have said. Yeah.
Okay, we do have one person who included a question by name. So Ari, did you want to read your question out loud or maybe combine the two comments?
Sure. Sorry, just
Oh,
taking a
thanks.
sec
Okay.
to turn on.
Yeah.
I gotta
Okay.
fix my hair. I guess I just see like a lot of apocalyptic visioning, especially in like dominating mainstream spaces and narratives, but also like in radical spaces. I was just in a talk last night by like pretty politically radical folks just being like, we're in a horrible space and all I can see for the future is just more horror. But it sounds like a lot of what y'all have been sharing feels hopeful today. Not to say that they're mutually exclusive, but like, what's the role of hope and how do you cultivate it? Or like, is hope not a thing you think about? Or like, do you think of something similar to hope? And how do you do that in a way that's not like avoiding realities?
Thank you, Ari. Who wants to tackle that one?
I can start. Is it Ari? Ari. I think about it as like keeping myself firmly rooted in two places, which is like the reality of like the situations that we're in, like ongoing genocides, climate crisis, and also keeping one foot firmly planted in imagination, and like building towards the world that I know is possible. Miriam Kaba, who's an abolitionist, I'm sure you're familiar with, wrote that hope is a discipline, and just like training myself and like building towards the world that I know is possible, like in the present time of like, how do I think community should operate? Am I operating in that way? Both like in my personal and professional relationships, like, am I showing up with the abolitionist practices and ways of being that I want to be living in? But I think it is really about like being rooted in both, because Miriam Kabo also wrote about like the need for reform, which prior to reading, we do this to free us as like reform. Like, I don't want to spend any time there, but the reality is there are people incarcerated right now. We're seeing the prisons flood in Florida. We're seeing the prisons flood in all parts of the South. And we saw it in Katrina. Like, there's folks who are incarcerated right now. So we need to spend some time in reform, but also like being firmly rooted and working towards the future is how I keep my hope buoyant.
Did anyone else want to comment? Christopher, Jodeen, Tory?
I mean, I guess I'll comment. The project I manage encourages people to think of hope in a lot of different ways. So, I feel like I should talk about it. The thing that it's kind of like the Marian Kaba saying as well, which is that hope is a discipline. And with writing, we're trying to change the narrative, or at least change writers. We want writers to flex a different muscle. A lot of writers have been trained to write dystopian stories. There's not a lot of courses out there that teach people how to write something hopeful, how to write something, about a liberatory future. And so encouraging people to think differently and write differently. I get a lot of letters, or emails, I should say, from people that say, I've been writing for 12 years and you got me to write differently. I'm so happy for this project to even just like challenge me. I didn't win the contest, but I feel changed as a person. And so, yeah, I think that it's important to kind of do the weird thing and say, like, have conversations around hope. Talk to your neighbors like that. This seems really strange. When's the last time you talked to someone that's close, like in your close proximity, and says, like, what's hope look like for you? I think like we don't really talk about this that much. And I think it needs to be more of a durable hope, and hope with courage. I think you need to pair those two together.
Jodeen or Christopher? Or if not, we do have another question, so no worries. We have one question in the chat from Gabriel. Gabriel, if you're on, do you want to share the question, or do you want me to read it?
Yeah, sure. Happy to share, and
Okay.
maybe we'll also get my video set up here. So thank you everyone for this awesome dialogue and insights and conversation. I was just curious as to because the was really struck by the Dear Alice video, so really appreciate that, Tory, and just kind of all the reflections around it so far, and just noticing the technologies present in there. And technologies are really on my mind as we're as I'm just seeing a lot of climate funders shift towards false solutions approaches around carbon capture, sequestration, hydrogen, all these other things. And so just kind of, internally balancing like, well, what is the role of technology, if it's driven by people, centering people, and kind of like, yeah, just if you all have thoughts about that and like, balancing that with like the presence and force that's pushing a lot of these false solutions that could maybe dominate, any kind of hopeful narrative, for a technology-enabled climate just future.
I'm happy to speak to this a little bit. I think one of the things that one of the reasons why we focus so much on the need to build political power rooted in our communities and led by our communities is because of the really like moneyed interests that are always going to be trying to push solutions that are really actually about capitalism and sustaining capitalism and continuing to make profits on the extraction of resources, well-being, knowledge from our communities. And so one of the things that we think is really essential is supporting organizations to have the capacities, resources, because it's really expensive, but the capacities and resources and support to be able to integrate voter education, outreach, and mobilization at a large scale into the other work that they're doing. Not devaluing or asking people to shift away from the other really important cultural community, well-being work that is at a focus, but supporting those who want to add in electoral and political organizing in ways that are authentic and meaningful to them into, their what they're working on, so that our communities aren't just, communities that people are engaging politically, but that we are actually leading political engagement and shifting the balance of power so that we can determine, with the IRA funding this year, there are literally hundreds of billions of dollars moving into states to support clean energy solutions. And some of those will end up being false solutions if we don't have our people leading and influencing how those resources are going to be shaped. And that takes political power to do. So, even though a lot of our folks and organizations that we work with didn't necessarily start out as that being what they're working on, part of what we do is support people to have the capacity and resources to be able to shift into that work alongside their other programming so that we can be in decision-making roles and governing roles.
Absolutely. Thank you, Jodeen. Oh, Christopher, please.
Yeah, I want to add a few thoughts because, Gabriel, your question was also kind of hit me in the guts too. Here in Brownsville, our communities are literally trying to stop Elon Musk. We don't have someone who's more resourced than him, and his fascism, his racism, his trans misogyny, his homophobia. All of it is just it's hard on us trying to do that. And so, of course, we have amongst ourselves, we're always having these conversations that we could say our critiques of techno-futurism, but we also know that it's not some sort of out there conversation. It's literally happening right here. The false solution is, oh, we must colonize other planets because this planet is done for, when it's not. And these other planets cannot sustain life, not that we would recognize as life. And in order to do that, to this false vision of the future, he's literally destroying sacred sites of our ancestors, and he's destroying life itself, whether it's be other plant and animal species, or contributing greenhouse gases into the environment at a massive scale here. Oh, so yeah, right now, of course, we're trying to use every sort of legal lever that we can pull, and I mean that in that Texas in 2016, September 1st, enacted a law that would create as a felony sort of like protesting what they call necessary infrastructure. So we could be arrested and go to jail for 10 years on a felony just for protesting and getting too close to a pipeline. And it's a very vaguely worded state law. So who knows if they want to add SpaceX, for example, into this infrastructure that they want to protect. That's the wall, that's the colonization of the oil and gas industry, and now SpaceX, because somehow colonizing the rest of the universe is how we're going to save humanity, while he's literally destroying the planet that's right here and ignoring the community when we resist, and ignoring Native people. So there's no free, prior, and informed consent. There's just this notion that we're going to go after this. We're also trying to fight a liquefied methane gas export terminals, 2 of them, and we actually got some foreign funders to divest from those projects. And then when the IRA was passed, or even before the IRA, around the time the IRA was going through, now the IRA, I just have to say, it codifies into law. The Gulf Coast of Texas, Louisiana, Appalachia, and Alaska are the sacrifice zones. They're dedicated sacrifice zones to continue American empire and resource extraction and energy global dominance. So now we're fighting the effects of the fact that Washington has decided that the Texas Gulf Coast would be completely sacrificed to petrochemical and oil and gas. This one project, Rio Grande LNG, actually secured IRA funding by saying that they were going to do carbon capture and storage, when literally the geology of this river delta can't support any sort of underground anything. Everything floods. It's going to push out the gas back into the air. But the thing is, that company never put out any sort of environmental statement or even a siting, didn't even say where they're going to put it. So it was all a farce. They got more federal funding to do their project from the IRA because they said they were doing carbon capture and storage. And just like last month, they said, oh, we're not doing carbon capture and storage. Plus, the French energy company that had invested in this place so that they could receive that methane gas, liquefied gas, the one that we got to divest reinvested when they announced that they were going to have a carbon capture and storage. So I wish I had a solution for you. And to Ari's question about hope, I don't have hope. I don't have hope. And we have to find ways of moving forward when we don't have hope. I admire Miriam Kaba, hope is a discipline, but remember, a lot of human beings have different neurodivergencies and different traumas and emotional responses. And what I've found is we can decouple our action and our responsibility to community, and we can decouple the fuel from that from hope. And it emerges into, for me, a form of compassion, but also responsibility. to the land, to my community, to my tribe, to my ancestors. And the thing is, we can move forward and we can heal with a range of our emotional showing up and our range of emotional, like what we can give and what we can't. I've been in situations where people have asked me about hope, and sometimes they've been extractive. They want me to give them hope. And that's why I've said, I have no hope to give you. What's motivating me is I'm not going to say all, but part of how I keep on going. And there's some days I can't. There are just some days I can't. We have to extend to everybody else that we're in partnership with, in community with. We have to extend them that compassion to know that we are human. We're not robots. We're not machines. And we're not always going to be able to truck forward. But in this cycle and circle, today I fall down, tomorrow I'll help you up.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Christopher, for bringing us to that point in the conversation. And it's made me think a lot about the role in philanthropy in particular, and the different spaces we go to, the role of toxic positivity and the expectations that puts on so many of us, I think especially racialized people when we go to these different spaces. So we just really appreciate that. Also want to respect everyone's time. We are at time. So thank you everyone for joining us. Thank you so much to our speakers. We will be following up with a recording and resources that our speakers will be sharing, and just appreciate everyone and hope to see you again soon. Bye.
Thank you.
Nanapale, free Palestine. Ayama Payasa.